So today we're going to loop back and look at what we've already addressed, starting with the reading from Marianne Williamson from a course, Gifts from A Course in Miracles, and it's about fear. So I'm going to read a few excerpts and give you a moment or two to consider. So this is titled Fear. There is nothing to fear. This simply states a fact. It is not a fact to those who believe in illusions. But illusions are not fact. In truth, there is nothing to fear. So one of the things she talks about, and I'm aware of from multiple sources, is there can only be fear or love. They do not coexist. So the idea is when you simply notice fear to shift into love. Now, remember from Emmett, when we talked about the principles that govern thought, he talked clearly about the principle of substitution. So we need to substitute love-based thoughts for fear-based thoughts. And the last part of it is, how deceived was I to think that what I feared was in the world, instead of in my mind. So the idea is to look at what you're afraid of and notice that only the anticipation will frighten you. So this is a big reading. It's something to contemplate or consider. And as you simply notice, in the meta process, the first step, if you're in fear, notice that. We're going to get deeper into that in future episodes and talk about how to use our emotional condition and transform those conditions. Specifically, we're going to talk about emotions like fear and anger. The four-step process for transforming fear. Know first that this is fear. So in other words, simply notice. And when you simply notice, do not judge. If you notice that you're judging, simply notice that. In other words, don't judge your judgment. Step 2, fear arises out of a lack of love. So once again, fear and love do not coexist. It's one or the other. The remedy for a lack of love is perfect love. Now, I can tell you what I mean by perfect love. It's unconditional, universal love. There are no enemies in the world. That's an illusion. It's based in the illusion of separation and superiority. Perfect love is the at one-ment. And notice how that word is given a different meaning than atonement. And then Pema Chodron talks about our grounding. So I'd start urging you now to think about your grounding. What are the basic beliefs that you're operating out of? The fundamental beliefs. So in a future episode, I offered some definitions, specifically power, which what I mean by power is able to be able, and possibilities. So we're talking about being, ability, and possibilities. We're on the cusp of what I consider to be a new renaissance. If you look at the work of Gregg Braden, Joe Dispenza, et al., Gene Houston, they're talking about abilities that I would consider to be latent abilities. And again, we're going to explore some of these abilities. For example, Gregg Braden talks about the ability to self-heal naturally or to self-regulate, like boosting our immune system in the moment. The other thing is the meta process is the overall process for this work. Simply notice, play with possibilities. Notice the word play with possibilities. Consciously choose. So I'm going to add a couple more definitions now. The way I define being is it's the essential self or the true self. And there's a lot of work going on in that area today. Quite exciting. And the work itself I describe as the art of being. So let me define art. The unique expression of one's true self. So art is not limited to painting and what we call creative endeavors. It's the unique expression of one's true self. Some of the foundational understandings we looked at are, I do not see the world as it is. I see the world as I perceive it to be. And I mentioned earlier that that's a severe limitation. So many people are caught in the trap of saying, I perceive this to be that way, and it's not true. The other one is just because we don't perceive something does not mean it doesn't exist. And I used the example of Hubble in a prior session, who looked into a, quote, dark area of space and actually sent back images of thousands of galaxies. And the last that we explored so far is all things are possible all the time. And we did a little exercise with that. So consider these foundational understandings as possibilities. It's really a way to orient oneself toward the work. So once again, the meta process, simply notice and pay attention to both words, simply notice. So we become observers of ourselves. Play with possibilities and consciously choose. And the thing about consciously, ultra important, most of our lives are governed by the unconscious mind. We have approximately 60 to 70,000 thoughts a day, most of which are unconscious and repetitive, some of which are problematic. So as you simply notice, the 4 areas that I offered are simply notice your thoughts, your waking thoughts, which you might see over time and simply noticing are certain patterns. Those patterns are probably bubbling up from the unconscious mind. So the good news is we can transform those thoughts through the principles that govern thought. The other thing to notice are emotions and moods. And it's real important to make a distinction between emotions and moods. So I'll use an analogy. An emotion is situational. Pretty easy to understand, pretty easy to process, relatively easy. Moods are repressed emotional states. So if you think about the current of a river, an emotion would be the surface current. If you've ever done any canoeing and turned over, if you get below the surface current into the undercurrent, it's much more powerful. So moods are much more powerful, and actually what they are unprocessed, repressed emotional conditions. So, for example, fear ultimately could turn into panic or terror. Anger could turn into rage. So when you're talking about moods, you're talking about something that's repressed and it's a pattern. So we'll get more into how to transform both emotions and moods in future sessions. The other thing to notice is impulses to action. So when you think about anger and fear, there's going to be a lot of impulses to actions associated with those two emotional states. The last thing to take a look at is the state of your body. Is your body in a state of discomfort in any of the organs? Is there pain in any of the organs or even physical structures? So those are 4 areas to notice. So continuing our review, we're going to look at the principles that govern thinking or thought. 2 big ideas related to this. Transforming personal thoughts is the key to one's destiny. Now, what we're going to tag on to that in the next video is we're going to talk about the relationship between thought and emotion and mood. The second big idea, these principles do not operate within time constraints. In doing work with people in Louisiana and North Carolina, one of the things that I notice is that people get frustrated in the transformative process because they're thinking about time. So these principles do not operate within time constraints. So one of the things I'll mention is we create our lives in thought, word, and deed. Right now we're on thought, and then we're going to go into emotion and mood. So the first principle is the principle of substitution. The way to transform a certain thought is to substitute another thought for it. Do not resist whatever you're thinking. Resistance, or I'll say this, what we resist persists. So as you simply notice your thinking, do not resist any particular thought. One way to resist is to judge. For example, this thought is good or bad, right or wrong, better or worse. Those are ways to resist, which will persist the thought process. The second principle is the principle of relaxation. Now, this is an interesting paradox because in the physical world, to get things done or to manifest takes effort. In the principles that govern thinking, the principle of relaxation says when you try to force your thoughts mentally, when you try to hurry mentally, you simply stop your creative power. So there are 2 important words, creative and power. Followed by the principle of subconscious activity. Now I'm going to elaborate on this a bit, how to do this. As soon as the subconscious mind accepts any idea, it immediately tries to put it into effect. So there's a big question. How does the subconscious mind accept any idea or any thought? And I would refer you to Joe Dispenza on this. He has a lot of YouTubes. He's got several books, or many books. What he advocates in changing the subconscious mind is mental rehearsal. And he talks specifically about things like, well, he uses the example of athletes, let's say a high diver, who is practicing high diving, and another person who's a high diver might mentally rehearse high diving. Both get the same result, or approximately the same result. So again, if you want to know how to change your subconscious mind, Joe Dispenza, Bruce Lipton is another resource. Greg Braden is another resource. Gene Houston is another resource. Followed by the principle of practice. There is no achievement without practice and more practice. That's why don't put any time constraints on this transformative process, provided it is done intelligently. The greater will be the proficiency and the sooner will it be attained. So practice, no time constraints. Use the information from Joe Dispenza et al. Followed by, and here's a biggie, the principle of forgiveness. You have to forgive others if you want to demonstrate over your difficulties and to make any spiritual progress, or actually any psychological progress, whatever way you want to look at it. So I'm going to introduce another foundational understanding. Forgiveness is for the forgiver and not the forgiven. And that's something to consider. Many people think they're forgiving the other. If you actually verbally forgive the other, you're moving into arrogance. And that may be hard to accept, but just play with the idea. The next principle is the principle of dual thought. It's a little misleading because it says every thought is made up of two factors, knowledge and emotion. So it's really not about dual thought, it's about knowledge and emotion. And again, Joe Dispenza addresses this directly. So does Greg Braden and Bruce Lipton. Followed by the principle of growth. What you think upon grows. Another way to phrase this is what we attend to grows, increases. What we intend becomes real. So the second part of this is whatever you allow to occupy your mind, you magnify in your own life. So we're talking about the power of attention and intention. I'm sure you've experienced this, where you attend to some malady and over time it increases. For example, some physical condition that is causing discomfort and a continued focus on that, and you'll notice that the pain increases. I've done progressive relaxation with people in physical pain, and inevitably what they say is, my pain has decreased. So all these principles are important and inclusive. So you might want to take one or two principles, simply notice what's going on in those 4 areas I mentioned, and shift your attention.